happy to be here to share a small story. Now, the topic for today's sermon is building God's kingdom. We are going to learn from a small story from the Bible about how God can choose young people to build God's kingdom, right? And here we have a story about Gideon. Gideon was the son of Joash, and he was an Israelite. And during his time, the Midianites were ruling over them because God had handed over the Israelites. They did not listen to God's instructions and they were doing all wrong things. And so God finally handed over the Israelites to the Midianites. Now, when the Midianites were in control, the Israelites did not have freedom to do whatever they wanted. They did not have freedom even to grow their own crops and have their own food because they had to have permission for each and everything. And so, what happened, Gideon, as a young person, he was trying to gather some grain for himself, his family, and his people. And so, he was near a wine press where he was threshing the wheat. He had to get wheat first and then they refine it and they use it. And so he was there at the threshing floor, and while he was busy around there, suddenly he heard a voice saying, Gideon, you're a mighty man of valor, means you're a very strong person. And usually they call the soldiers who are well known as mighty men of valor. And so when he called him that, and he said, no, I'm not a mighty man, I'm just a young boy, young man, and I don't even belong to any of the army, and I don't belong to any great family. I'm just a small person, the youngest in my home, the least in my family, and I'm just a humble, simple person. And how can you call me mighty? And he said, no, God has chosen you to save the Israelites from the Midianites. And he said, who, me? Am I going to do it alone? And he said, yes, you are going to lead the army to win against the Midianites. And now he said, okay, if all that you say is true, and if this message is true from God, now just wait here a while. I'll go inside, I'll prepare something and come. And so he goes in and he brings food. So he wanted to entertain the stranger, and so he brought some broth, he brought some flesh, and he killed a kid and he brought some flesh, and he brought some bread, unleavened bread. And so he kept it here and he wanted him to eat. And now this person said, now you wanted to know that this message is from God, isn't it? So I will show you that it is from God. So he said, you take all these things and put them on the rock. And so he brought and put these things on the rock. And after he put them on the rock, and then he poured the broth in this, fire came from heaven and consumed everything. And then after a while, this person disappeared. And then Gideon understood that the message he heard was from God himself. God was choosing him to lead the children of Israelites to come out from the Midianites' clutches. And so Gideon was beginning to think now. And again he hears a message from God, and the Lord said the same night, he said, your father has some idols on top. He has a grove, and now you have to cut down all that. You have to break down the altar where he is burning sacrifices for Baal, and then you have to see that we are able to sacrifice to the true and living God. And so he did the same thing. He took 10 of his men and he went and he broke down the altar that was burning all bulls for the Baal. And so the people came to know, and they were all getting very upset, and they said, this man, Gideon, the son of Joash, is doing all this against us, and he is burning down altars. And so these people were so upset, and everyone was ganging together, and they wanted to kill him. But who was there with him? Who chose him? God chose him, and God was there with him, and nothing happened to him. God didn't allow him to be harmed. And then he gets a message again that he has to lead the army of God, army with the children of Israelites. And so he wanted a sign. And so he tells God again, he says, Lord, I will put a fleece outside. And if this fleece is all soaked and the rest of the ground is all dry, then I will believe that this message is from you. And so the next morning when he came out, sure as he said, the fleece was all soaked and the land was all dry, and he was able to squeeze out a lot of water from this fleece. And he said, yes, this message is surely from the Lord. But he still wasn't convinced very much. He still had little doubt. He said, Lord, now I'm sorry I may be making you upset, but I want one more sign. Now this time, this one should be dry. The fleece should be dry. And the rest of the ground should be wet. And sure enough, the next day when he came out, he found that the fleece was dry and the whole ground was wet. Now this was some miracle that God had made, right? And then he was able to understand that God was really calling him to save the children of Israelites. Now what do we learn from this story? He was just a young man. He was not a big mighty warrior. But God chose him. Why? Because he had the willing heart to work for God. He was willing to take the challenge that God was giving in his hand. Though he was small, though he was the least, though he was the weakest, because he was willing to accept God's word and willing to obey God's instructions, God took him and used him to save the Israelites from the Midianites. And if we as young people are willing to listen to God's word, God is willing to use us to spread his message and be a Christian warrior for Christ.